All right, so here is the outline for today, as rough as it could possibly be. We're doing as I said, we already have done the 15-minute intro, so we can delete that. This is how I broke down the hours that we have here. So we have, we've already hit on this too, so what we want to get out of this, but I just want to ask everyone again to reaffirm this. And then we're going to review specificity and inheritance based off feedback. Then we're going to make a button, and I like to start with buttons when doing interfaces because they're really complex. There's a lot of things in there if you're trying to make them stable and reset and use across different elements. They're kind of complex to make, so I was thinking that would be a good foundational example of covering a lot of things in CSS. And then we're going to talk about responsive web design, and then we're going to get into positioning as well as display types, and then we're going to build an interface of grids.
Nope. I'm good to go.
Awesome. All right, so as I said, this is CodePen. CodePen's really fantastic, so codepen.io. I relate it, and this is probably a bad way of saying this, but I relate it to Dribble. So if you want to like find something like, I don't know, I want inspiration about pizza, you can go here and you can see like people's different things that they've done with pizza. But that's probably not that realistic or something that you'd be doing. If you wanted to do something like, let me think, accessibility, and look up different like drop-downs. So like here's a drop-down that's aligned to accessibility standards and different things like that. So it's a great way to learn and also to see what people are doing, how they approach it. So I highly recommend it. There's also this project view now. So you can create a new project, and a project is kind of like an IDE online, or it's a full text editor, and you can run a full project from here and deploy it and run it and share it. So that's pretty cool. And my CodePen I've used to build out some of my open source projects. So my CodePen is Nice Transition. So I'm Nice Transition on Twitter, as well as on most things. So these are some of the libraries that I've written and have shared on here. Some of the styling has gotten a little messed up here, but again, if you're on, I guess you guys will be on CodePen, so follow me on Twitter. I have 22 followers, not that many. But anyways, this is where I share a lot of my examples in code. The other day, I was just goofing around. This CSS is awesome meme that goes around. And the funny thing about this meme is people always talk about how CSS is like broken, but then to actually create this is not that easy to do. It actually takes some CSS tricks to make it happen. So that's why I decided just to be like, you know what, I'm gonna actually build this out. So I built that out the other day. I do some other like weird fun things or things I'm working on a client. Like this was one showing about the some of the different ways that you could, I can't think, use the blend modes. So this is like a gray image, and then how it's sized and using intrinsic ratios, and then how the image is made gray by filters. So this is a color image, and then how this colored image has now a mix overlay on top of it of a red color, and then some variations on it. So this is just using CSS to manipulate this image and to put it out there. And so there's a color overlay, a change black and white, and then kind of the steps of doing it. So little things like that I find interesting.
Sorry.
Yep. No, what's up?
Okay. So just to relay everything you said, you just created so the image is grayscale, but based on the overlays, you can get some pretty unique patterns out of it or color texture.
Yeah. So like if I were to go to, I guess I'll go to this one and just show you what's happening here. So there's an image here, and on the before there's a red overlay on top here.
Yeah.
And that red overlay has a blend mode of overlay. If I were to remove the blend mode, it would look like that. So blend mode does that mixing in there. And then it also has an opacity on there. So it gives it a nice little like effect. And then in addition to that, So there I removed that blend mode, and then it has this filter of grayscale 100%. So I just removed that, and there's the original image. And then you can even do stuff like 50% grayscale on here. So kind of taking it down. Actually, yeah. So you can see like this gets grayer and grayer as it goes on. So I do little things like that, and I always bring this up, but caniuse.com is a website where you can look up CSS properties. So like that was using filter. So CSS filter effects, you can see that majority of browsers use it, but I wrote that in a way that it still falls back for IE. That's where like the opacity and the transparency was there with the solid color. So I always think about how it falls back in CSS. And then if I use blend mode, and there's two different ones. So there's background blend mode. You can see like Edge doesn't support, neither does IE, but that's why there's that transparency there. And then that doesn't rely here. But for the most part, like it has a decent support. If you see yellow, it means like caution. Green means, yeah, you can use it anywhere. Red means it doesn't work. But there's usually some kind of fix on that if you really wanted to go that approach. But that's where some of the play in of like, making sure that you have a good fallback. Anyways, so now what we're going to do is we're going to spend, I put 20 minutes here. I'm going to try to do this in 15 minutes and try to go through this as quickly as possible. I do have a lot of videos of myself talking about specificity and inheritance on YouTube. So if you do a search on YouTube, I record a lot of videos. I do a lot of sessions. So understanding specificity, there's an hour-long video of me talking about it, and then a 2-hour-long one here. So I do discuss specificity and inheritance a lot. So YouTube, I don't know how many videos I have on there, but they're all primarily educational. And for this class, I did put together this front end, how to set up your computer, and some of the interface development, preliminary stuff, prerequisites, but all this stuff's here, and this is a hilarious video, so I highly recommend watching this at a later time. So anyways, there's that. Anyways, getting into specificity and inheritance. These are the two core pieces of CSS. So when people start talking about CSS, they're always like, it's the world's easiest language to learn. For example, here we have this code here. So this unordered list and these list items inside here and some content inside here. So this is HTML. If this wasn't inside of CodePen, I would have to create a file, and it just needs to be a plain text file and end it with a .html. And I can open and run that, and as basic as it gets to creating a web page. I do have some videos online for even intro for starting HTML and CSS. And if you have questions on that, definitely just reach out to me. But I'm in CodePen, and it uses Zen coding, so I can put this exclamation mark and hit tab. And this is a basic setup of a web page. In CodePen, you don't need to add the HTML and the body or the head because it already has that built into it. And if you want to add stuff into the head, you just go into your settings and you add additional pieces here, just so you know. And so this treats everything that's inside the body node, which is the core piece of the DOM for writing your content in the web page itself. So as I said, we have a div. We put this here, and I'm going to put lorem. And if I put lorem and I put 30 after and hit tab, it's going to complete a sentence for me, which is really nice. I'm going to put this down here so I stay on track. All right, so that's the basic of this. And then if you wanted to learn CSS, well, a lot of people are like, there's an element here, and here's my CSS. So this is my CSS. This would typically be in a .css file, and this is my .html file, or anything that's rendering a view. CSS is as easy as this. Here's my div. That's this element name, and we have these curly brackets, and then I put properties inside here. So this is a property, and this is a value. CSS is written as property, colon, value, semicolon. The semicolon is required. And from here, this is how you can apply stylings. So right here, this went to red. So it went from black to red. Black is the default. If it changes to blue, it's blue. It's as simple as that, and that's where people say you can learn CSS in 5 minutes. However, if this is how you think you write CSS, and that's the only pieces of it, then you're doing it incredibly wrong, because specificity and inheritance are things that require you to have knowledge of the DOM elements itself, as well as how CSS renders, and a lot of people don't understand that. So for example, before we get into inheritance, I'm using Chrome here, but Chrome, if I right-click on something and I go to inspect, this brings up developer tools. One thing I meant to mention earlier, and I see this tab here, is this is an awesome articles that Chris Coyier, again, wrote. So Chris Coyier did CodePen, but he also is the founder and author of CSS Tricks. So this is literally some of the best writing on introduction on CSS and HTML. This is the basics of basics, and some best practices inside here, like fallback colors, like if you're using an image and the image doesn't load, have a background here. The difference between ID, selectors, and classes. It's absolutely amazing. So if anyone's ever like, hey, where do I go to learn CSS? They can, A, follow the Columbus Web Group, or they can also go to CSS Tricks and get the learning here. So if you're new to CSS, I highly recommend going there. So anyways, back to where I was. We're in Chrome Developer Tools. How I got there was I right-clicked and went to inspect. I can also hit Command-Shift-C, which is the shorthand for this, but it brings up this. One of the weird things that I usually don't call out, but I will today, is this little ... here. This is where the doc will show, and it's actually really important. I know some people struggle on where to move this and how to show this. And this is the left side, right side. So I just want to bring that up because that's one of those things that I don't think about, but I've had people ask me questions about. All right, so again, what I can do is I can right-click on this, and this is the element, and I can see this div. Here you can see the CSS that's being rendered. So I define this as blue. So if I change this to just do a star selector, which is every single element, you can see that if I highlight this, it's still bringing up that blue. Star selector, just so you know, is reserved for far-reaching CSS properties. Things like a box sizing and border box is the primary only use for it. If I were to apply star here and show you something like an outline, 1 pixel solid, it actually applies this to every single element inside the page. I use it a lot when testing and also building out an interface. If I want to see where a container is, if I didn't start it from the beginning. Sometimes like CSS or when you're building an interface, you can be thrown off by old code or code that you don't want. All right, so I'm going to go back to this div, inspect, go here, and it says div, and it's bringing up the CSS property. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here is there's a slight color variation. It's like an off gray color, and inside there it says user agent style sheet. User agent style sheet is the definition from the browser itself and the element. So every single HTML element has a style associated with it. And then from there, every browser inherits those. So these are from the actual spec. So when you hear spec in HTML or CSS, what that is the core definition of what it is. So if I go to W3, see, oops, and I look at any of these, so if I just did something like div.
Dan had a question on, do you use resets, do you use HTML tags as well, or just the asterisk?
Wait, say that again, on resets?
Yeah, for resets, do you use HTML tags as well, or just?
That's a great question. I will show you a demo of that, but yeah, for resets, and just so you guys know, a reset is an override of something that you want in your interface that's globally, I guess, defining an element. So resets are typically on a type selector, which is something like a div, or a star selector, meaning that it's going to be the most far-reaching selectors that you have in your CSS, and you're defining it as this is how I want all divs to be. So if I wanted all H1s to always be red no matter where they are, I define H1 with a color of red. A normalize, and a lot of people ask about normalize. A normalize is where you're resetting or you're defining an element so it's consistent across different browsers. So for example, box sizing is a normalize because non-WebKit browsers render differently than WebKit browsers. And then a reset would be like I'm removing the margin top and bottom on an unordered list or a padding. And again, I'll show an example of that later. Dan, does that make sense?
Gotcha.
It's cool, thanks. So anyways, from here, you can look up all the documents on an HTML element, and they also give you the definition of what is inherited here and the attributes that are coming through on an individual element. Instead of doing all that trouble, what you can do is, again, just highlight it here, and let me make this bigger, and you'll see the user agent. So again, user agent means it's defined by the spec. That is, everything in HTML and CSS and JavaScript is open source and was defined by the community and has evolved since the mid-90s. If you want to create your own spec, you can do that. Anyone can do that, and there's different stages of it, but you propose a draft, or you have to do a lot of politics involved, but you propose a draft, you get people to back that draft, and then it goes into about a 2 to maybe 10-year process of reviewing and defining, and if it gets approved by everyone, and by everyone, it's a huge organization of people and a lot of politics, and primarily companies like Google that have to sign off and be like, yes, we'll use your property inside of our browsers. So with that, then it becomes available in every single browser. So here we look at the div. By default, a div has a display block, and it doesn't have a color. Now, again, remember if I remove this, it was black. The reason why it's black is also that is defined by default from the browser. So even though I have div selected here, I can go to body and look at it. But I can look at the CSS property here and be like, here's color. And I can click on color and it will let me go there. I can expand this and see other pieces of it. But what I can also do is, and this is not my computer, so bear with me. What do I want to show here? There we go. I was looking for the show all. If I inspect here and I go to show all, this is all the CSS properties that are defined for that div element. If they're kind of lighter, that means that those are not being applied right now or they're not being overwritten. So the only one that's going to be kind of full color is going to be color once we get to it. But these are all the properties that make up a div. So when you see user agent, it's what's rendering on the screen here and the ones that you're overwriting. And that's from computed. And every single element on a page has that. If I go to this unordered list, this UL here, and highlight it, it's going to be different than what a div has. And then if I go to styles, you can actually see the ones that are being applied to the browser. So if I was going to overwrite these would be the ones that I would want to overwrite, and those would be resets. So as I said earlier, like a margin before and after, that's a margin top and margin bottom. If I set margin top to margin bottom to 0, that would be referred to as a reset. If I did padding left 0, that would also be a reset on an unordered list or a UL. All right, so that's a really quick understanding of what a user agent is. But what inheritance is again, how black was working. But that's not a good example here. I'm going to change this div where it's being defined on this element to be blue. I'm going to do something that's apparent in the DOM structure. So I'm going to make this be color red, and I'm going to get rid of this blue right now. So now all my text is red. How this is happening is through inheritance. And what inheritance is it's looking from an element that's higher in the DOM order in the CSS. So as I said earlier, like your DOM actually looks like this. And I can keep it here, even though CodePen's going to hate this. So we have body, and we're putting this div inside here. So this div is inside body. And even though I haven't defined it as a color, it's getting a color of red. And that's because body is actually a parent of it. And you can collapse this and you can see body, and then like the div is inside here. So because of that, it's inheriting. So if I highlight this div and I look at my CSS, it says inherited from body. If there was something inside this div, let's just put a span around this. And I made this color be yellow. Ooh, let's do blue. And we'll say all spans are green. So now this span is green, this is blue because it's defined here in red. So this is red because it's inheriting. Where is it inheriting from? Body. So you can see right there it says inherited from body and the color of it. I can also go to this unordered list, click on it, and see that it's right there. But if I go to computed and define here, and if I remove the show all, it removes a lot of the nonsense and just the important ones. And if I click this, it will take me to where it's been defined. So that's a really important thing to know. Now, if I look at this div, this is being blue. This guy inside here is green because I've defined it as green. Let me get rid of this for a quick second. If I get rid of this, even though the body was defined as red, it was inherited, and then this span is inheriting the blue because it's within the span. And that's why this guy's blue and this guy below is red. And if I want to override it, I put green. So the reason why I have this here to show is, do you see this slash through this? You want to avoid these slashes when writing HTML and CSS. The goal for a project is to really only have slashes on user agent as well as inherited. So if this was something a little bit different, like color's okay because color inherits down, but if we did something like background color, which does not go through. Oops. So do you see that's cool how that looks? How this div is background color red. This span is actually having the background color red because it has a transparent background, but nothing's been defined. If I were to change this background color, this is a really bad example, as black. Again, it's overriding that. This is not actually an example of that. I'm trying to think of I don't write CSS this way, so I'm trying to think of a way that like the slashes happen all the time. What's something that people do? CSS property. I can't even think of one right now besides colors. Well, let's just do. Yeah, that's fine. But basically, the goal of writing CSS is to avoid slashes. And CSS is a language of extending, not overriding. The only time that it's really accepted to override is if you're inheriting, and that's basically it. So that's inheritance. And then what specificity is, and the other thing with inheritance, let me show you one thing. And this is a huge gotcha for a lot of people getting started. So you see that this is green, the span's green. We're going to change this to purple. Even though I changed the span to purple, the reason why it's not purple is because there's a span after that's green. If I were to change the order of this and put this span after that's now defined purple, this becomes purple. If I change this to yellow, it will become yellow over here. So it's overwritten. And then if I change again the order and I put this up here, it doesn't work. So CSS reads from top to bottom, and the items at the bottom override something that has equal value to it. And that equal value is referred to as specificity. So inheritance gets overwritten by where it is in the CSS, but then more importantly, the specificity here. So if I wanted this to still be yellow, I could make that happen. So how I could do that is to add specificity. So I could say div, and the direct descendant of it is a span. So a span that's a direct descendant of div gets the color yellow. And now this guy is yellow. The reason why it is yellow, even though it's before instead of after, is because it has higher specificity. Specificity is the definition of how you're declaring what you're targeting in your CSS. And that's a series of selectors that you can use. And what I always recommend people going to is 30 selectors you must memorize. And these ones are, this is just scratching the surface on CSS selectors, but these are the core ones that are really, really important to kind of get going and to know your way around CSS. So these are all the CSS selectors that are out there, and a CSS selector is just how you're applying your CSS styling to the DOM itself. So here, this guy has higher specificity because it has more rules. And I guess a way of thinking of it isn't necessarily the longer the selector is, but it's the importance of the selector and more things that you're defining. So for example, even though this span down here is after, this is yellow because this is higher specificity. If I wanted to override that, I could say div. And these are now equivalent, so it's going to be green. So it's now the order stuff. But if I didn't do something like that, I could say body, and I could say div. And now if this was anywhere on the page, so this is going to be yellow, and this is going to be green. So CSS specificity is just one of the orders, but it's also the way that you're applying your styles and how specific you are with your CSS. That's as quick as I can probably go through specificity and inheritance. And I'm sure I'll think of a better example of inheritance and where to avoid. Oh, you know what? Let's just do this.
So Dan had another question. So if we have a property crossed out in a child element, do you want to avoid that?
Yeah, so this will be a better example of what I was trying to think of. I don't know why I was completely blanking on this. So I'm going to add a class here and call it demo. So now what we've done is we've defined this width on a type selector, which was div, and it's centered on the page, and the width of it is 500, so it's centered here, and it's right and left. And what I'm going to do is I have this class called demo, and I'm going to make it a width of 800 pixels. So now it's wider. Now if I look at my CSS here, we have demo with a width of 800 pixels, and then we have a div that has a slash through. Notice that it doesn't say inherited here. If you see a slash and it doesn't say inherited, that means that you can optimize the performance of your CSS as well as optimize the way that you're writing your code. These are bound to happen in writing code. You want to avoid it. The only time you want to see slashes is from user agent and inherited, and that's it. So this means that this is like bad code. This is bad code for multiple reasons. You should not be defining on type selectors unless it's a reset. So margin left, margin right being auto is bad code because it's on a div, a type selector, meaning that every single div anywhere in my project is going to have these definitions. And then I'm overriding it right here with a width here. So this is what goes down the path of horrible CSS. If you want an example of really awful code, look at the core CSS of SharePoint. So if there's any SharePoint developers, if you want a really fun moment of your life, look at bad CSS code by looking at that. It is literally some of the worst code you've done in your share. It's awful, awful. So Dan, does that help you?
Yeah, it's starting to make more sense. It just, I guess, what I need to look for is if I look at the dev console and I see that there are crossed out properties in an element that's not inherited,
Yep.
then I need to optimize it.
Yep.
Basically.
Yep. So like this one, to redo this, what we would do is we would remove this 500 in here from here, and we would say, oh, all demos are this, and then We'd probably create a helper class. So this was a question that someone asked was, what's object-oriented CSS? So we're going to create a container. And inside container, it's going to have a margin left and right of auto. And then we're going to create a helper class that's called like width1. And we're going to define it as 500. And then we're going to create one that's called width2. And we're going to make it 800. And now we're going to go back to the CSS here. And we're going to add, we'll keep demo, we'll have container, and we'll have width2. So now we have this. Did I misspell container? Yep. So we have width2 here in this demo. So now if I wanted to have another div that was a different width, and call it width1, and we put the lorem in there, oops, lorem 25, and width1, width2, oops. So now we have two different widths. Come on. Oh, crap. So we have two different widths here, one that's 500 and one that's 800, but it's utilizing the same kind of code back and forth. And then if we wanted to, we could add additional styling for demo and do something like font weight, or let's just make this one be red, and we'll remove demo here. So now we have two things that are utilizing container class, two that have widths but variations of it, and then one that's extending CSS and overriding inheritance. So this guy, this red is, you can see right here, this red is going to have a slash through here. Oops. Do I still have that div here? Yeah, I still have this from the demo stuff earlier. Let's give this a different color. Let's give this.
Technically, since you had that div tag and it had blue, and then you set demo and had the color.
Yeah.
That would cross out, but that would be an inherited property that was crossed out, correct?
Yep. So look at this. So demo right here. Do you see inherited, the red slash through? There's no other slashes. So we're extending this and taking over this inheritance on demo, and that's why this one's green. This is a width of 800 because it's defined as width2. This is width1, and then they're both utilizing this. So the idea of object-oriented CSS is also, so it's to have multiple classes that are single function, and then to combine them as needed. So then you can mix and match and make variations of it without having to rewrite your CSS. The idea is also to separate styling from the structures itself. So anything that is stylistic would be its own class. And you treat things in a category of objects, so structural pieces, reusable containers or grids, and then you have actual containers, which are components. They're single-use base. You have utilities, which are helper classes, or things that extend, things like color, variations in font, and all this other stuff in between. And I do have a demo later that, if we get to it, we'll talk about. And when we get into the last section, that stuff we'll be definitely covering. Cool?
Okay. Thank you.
Did I lose anyone on inheritance or specificity? For those that are new to CSS, you feel better? Feel good? Feel good? Are you going to pass the quiz? Yeah. All right, cool. Awesome. Great. So moving on to the next section, we're, again, a little bit over, and this always happens. We're going to make a button. And from there, we're going to start with a reset on what a button is. So from this code, I'm going to put a button element inside here. Oops. God, I'm meant to do this. And I'm going to say submit. So inside here, you'll notice this button. And every single browser renders a button differently. So first, I'm going to look at this. I'm going to go to inspect. And in inspect, I'm going to look at all the user agent pieces that make this button. And you'll see all these definition here. So it has this flex start in Chrome. It has text align center and all this stuff. So I didn't define any of this, the browser did. If I want to make something that's reusable from a button to an anchor, I need to make sure that's happening. So I can have a button style on really any element, but I can have an anchor, and I can put submit here. And you'll notice that it looks different than this. If I do an input, and I put a type of submit with a value of submit, these are going to look identical, but these are all three different ways of making a button, but they're not the same. So to do something like this, I'm going to use C button, which is C stands for component. It's just the way that I organize my CSS. There's a really great article about this. So let me pull this up really quick. Ben Papalardo called me out on this the other day, that whenever I'm thinking now, I do the theme song of the OC. That is my thinking for some reason.
What's
Huh?
da-na-na-na-na,
Yeah, da-na-na-na-na. Yeah. So, yeah, it's actually right here, so I had it open. So more transparent UI code. Okay, Alexa. So this is a really great article about naming conventions in CSS and really giving these namespaces out there. So O dash stands for an object, C dash is a component, U dash is a utility or helper, T dash is a theme, S dash is, this one's rarely used, but it's for declaring scope, and also this comes up in like MB star frameworks. I never really use this, but it's part of SMAX. Underscore is a hack or an override. JS dash is a JavaScript related, and QA is meant for something testing. There's a plug right behind you, literally right behind you, behind your seat.
Yeah.
So C dash stands for component, so this is a button component. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a reset first on this button, and I'm going to start by looking at this button and doing an inspect and seeing what makes it up. So for a button, I see all these pieces. So cursor's default. Most of the time I want my cursor to be a pointer hand, but these don't have pointer hands. So you can see that this is a pointer on an anchor, but not on here. So I'm going to first do that. I'm going to say cursor is pointer. So
Kevin had a question. Is this BEM? I don't know if that's...
It's not BEM.
Okay. It's not BEM.
Yeah. Great question. So BEM stands for block element modifier. BEM is looking at this. So we have a parent, and we call this pizza. Actually, we'll call it box. Ooh, Boz. And then inside box, we'll have pizza. So we'll have box double underscore, double underscore pizza. And we have my content inside here. So what this is referring to as pizza is a child of box. So pizza is the element here, and box is the block. The idea of BEM is to organize your code so then you know how to write it. So it relates your DOM to your CSS, so you go back and forth. So you don't necessarily have to see the DOM to understand the CSS. And by looking at the CSS, you don't have to see the DOM. And it pairs and couples CSS together, so it keeps it organized. The story that I always say is before I adopted BEM, and that was probably about 5-6 years ago, I felt like my code, I was always rewriting from one project to another. When I adopted BEM, my code, instead of rewriting or redoing it every single time, became reusable. And that was the big thing with BEM is instead of rewriting code or refactoring, it was let's have a structure and let's reuse it on every single project. So it sped up my process a lot, and about 80% of my code is reusable because of BEM. So that's a quick little BEM. And again, I have a video on YouTube. If you do a Google search for Kevin Mack BEM, B-E-M, you can find that. All right, back to this. We have these three different guys right here. And again, we're looking at these. And here's the HTML, which isn't that exciting. The other thing I'm going to do is, you may not notice this, but look at the fonts. There are two different fonts here. And form elements do something very strange, unlike anything else. So let me show you this. So if I put body and I put font family sans serif, This is going to turn into sans serif. You'll notice that this turns into sans serif, and so does this. This looks like it's sans serif and the same font, but it's actually a completely different font. Let me show you something. I'm on your computer, so I don't know what fonts you have. Let's just put Georgia. You'll have this. So notice how this font is this, and these are still a sans serif font. And this is a serif font, and this is a serif font, which is Georgia. Form elements define their own font family, which is really, really bizarre and weird. How I know this is, again, I look at button, and it has system UI on Chrome. So if I wanted this button to maintain the inheritance, I could say font family, inherit. Actually, that's not right at all. It's, Georgia. And now this is going to be the same. Did I misspell that? Oh, Mike, you know what? I didn't add the classes on here. Because, yep. C button. There we go. Because we went down that BEM path. There's a million things I love talking about. BEM is probably my number one. That's an overstatement. All right. I can't remember if inherit, I may be wrong on this, but let's see if that works. Yep. So that inherits the font family Georgia inside here. So now this has this reset on this button. So now I can change this to any font here, and it has it. But we're getting closer to having these all three look the same, but they're completely different. Other things that I'll notice is, so we've overwritten the user agent of that button, and we've defined it here. We've also had pointer to all of them, so now they're all the same. This has a smaller font size. So what we're also going to do is we're going to say font size is 1 rem, and it's going to inherit that size. Nice. Or in this one, I may actually want to do an M and inherit the parent container. Other thing is this anchor has an underline. These ones don't. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do target any anchor that has a class of C button and say text decoration is none. And now these have text decoration as none. But now this has a border around here and the space. Where that's coming from, right here is this padding. So let's do a padding of, 0. So now they have no padding here. What else does this guy have that the other one doesn't have?
Jordan is curious the difference between rem and m/other flexible units.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of unit values that you can have. So we have body here, and I'm just going to do, actually I'll use the UL as an example here, or the unordered list. So right now, by default, the browser's root font size is 16 pixels, and that's by the user agent. You can actually update that through your accessibility settings. If you want it to be 32, then all your base font size is 32. But if I look at this UL here, and I look at the font size, it is going to be 16 pixels from the browser. Font size 16 pixels. And that's because by default this element is inheriting that. But I could say font size is 2M. And what that's going to make this be is basically 32 pixels right here. So it multiplies the parent container. Now if I said something like this, li, and I said font size 2M, this is now going to be 64. So why that's happening is this is multiplying 2M by 2. So it's 2 times 2 times the root font size. So every single time you go down, it's getting multiplied. If I just put this on the li here and put 2, it's going to go back to 32. Now, if I wanted to say something like this, What did I say? Let's say first child. So first child is 2M. And then if I made these all font size 4M, so this is going to be 64, I can change this to rem. And what this does is M is looking at the parent and multiplying it out, where rem is looking at the root font size. So R just stands for root, and without the R, it is then looking at the parent and multiplying it out. And that's how it works.
Is M short for elements?
You know, I don't know what it stands for, to be honest. No, it's the width of an M. A width of an M inside the font.
Seriously?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it means, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The theme song of 3.5 Men or 2.5 Men just came to mind.
Is that
2.5. Can we do a 2.5 M button?
yeah, I don't know. That's a weird reference. Yeah, I like it though. All right, so back to making this button.
Dan wanted to clarify, rem is 16 because of the root or HTML tag?
It's from the root. So the other thing I can also define is there's a CSS property called root, which every browser has. And this got really popular in, so you don't need to define an HTML tag because of components in HTML now, and also like MV star frameworks that bring in partials. So root is the rendered highest DOM element inside of a container of HTML. So if I say font size is 20 here, I've just updated the root font size for my browser.
Instead of its default 16?
Yeah, and that's different than body as well as HTML. It's one step high. Like HTML is actually equivalent to root in most cases, but if it's a shared component or root is going to actually be one step higher.
Above HTML?
Yeah, yeah. So it's an interesting one. So if you're ever trying to apply a global override on font, that's where you would do it. And I did write a UI scalable library, and that is all based off of, oops, it's on my code pen. And how that works is all the differences between font sizes and stuff like this. So if I change this view really quick, you'll see that this font scales. And this is using purely CSS to scale your font. And it's just a combination of rems and viewport width, so VW. And this works in all modern browsers since IE 10. And this just generates the math for you. Anywho.
Before we get back on a roll, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why, because I've actually played with some of this stuff, why use the HTML button tag versus just styling CSS the way you want your button to look?
What do you mean? So like you mean like right here?
So as someone who has only dabbled in CSS just because like I wanted WordPress something or other to look different, I've just always like as part of an link tag just added a button class that puts this block around there.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So every HTML element has a specific use case, and it's based around the content and the context of using it. So button is reserved for form submission, and it requires either an HTML element like a form that can be submitted or JavaScript to be applied to it. So in the proper sense, if you're using JavaScript to navigate through your experience, then you should use a button. If you're submitting a form, you should use a button. In reality, you should be using an input type is equal to button on a form. But no one ever does that, and it's also kind of painful to style. So that's where people use the button tag. An anchor is meant from one page to another. People always mix up the difference of context of like, I want it to look a certain way versus the functionality of it. So like the rules behind organic search and accessibility really are based around making sure that your content has the right HTML wrapper and its right use case. And then in addition to that, making sure that the content is also related to the right element. Like any body copy should be in a p tag. And that's for bots as well as any readers to help understand and interpret it.
Yeah. Okay,
Does
so
that make sense?
It sounds like a button HTML element is supposed to trigger some sort of kind of back-end process, whether that's JavaScript or sending data through this form.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Cool. So going back here, we look at these other things that are inside here, and margins all not set here, but let's look at this guy. Anything else that's throwing off here? Everything looks cool. Everything seems aligned. Inline block, pointer. All right. Other thing is I am actually going to define this as a display inline block because this is currently an inline item. So now these are all the same. And what we're going to do is we're also going to remove the borders around here by saying border is equal to 0. Actually, let's give it a border 1 pixel solid. And then I'm also going to add some padding around here. I'm just going to do this so they're all the same. So now these are starting to look more like buttons. One of the hidden things that you won't see on the desktop, so when you're also building this out, you want to look at other things like iOS. So iOS actually has a box shadow on it, and different browsers also render this differently. And if I were to open this up in Safari, I would see a shadow around it. And the background color on mobile also has a gradient. So you want to define a background color. But I'm not going to do that right now, and I'm not going to do this. Typically what I do is I have C button, and then I will have something like _ default. And my default is the default settings I want on my button. So here I'm going to put padding, and then I'm going to put the color is, well, we'll keep color. We'll do default this, and then we'll do I'm trying to think what else I want to do here. We'll just do default, and then I'm going to create a color. We'll do primary, and that's how I'm going to define the color here. And this is going to be red with a color of white. So now what I need to do is add these classes on this button, as well as on this guy and this guy. And then I'm going to also add primary. So now these three all look the same, and they can be used interchangeably. And then now it's just applying these in the right context inside my HTML. I can also now spin off a really very stiff variation of this, and we'll call it secondary. And we'll call it, let's do blue and yellow, 2 worst colors of all time. So now I can have variations on my buttons and have secondary inside here. And if I want to make one that doesn't have the default padding, I can make button large. And I can do something like 20 pixels, 40 pixels, and I can do a font size of 2M. And now if I add button large to this guy, this one is going to look completely different. But I can easily make variations off of this. And then the other thing that you'd want to do when making a button is do the hover states on these. And I'm going to call out this. Whenever you're, for accessibility, you don't want to just do hover. You also want to do focus. And for the hover state, we're going to make this be blue. We're going to keep the color white because it will continue. So any of the primary buttons now turn blue on hover. So now we have, I can make more and more variations of this button, but this is a good start of setting it up.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So let's just say, I don't know if you intended this as you were doing it, but let's say the properties in C button class, you're pretty much always going to use. Why not make your default, your secondary, your primary classes inherit those properties instead of just adding it inline every single time?
It's for the flexibility of this because I don't know how many buttons I'm going to have in my interface, and it's to give me more control.
Okay. You can see clearly.
Yeah.
This is everything.
Yep.
That's getting.
And then you can do stuff like this too. I've done this. This kind of gets messy and it's confusing if you have someone that's not, I guess, really that in the know about CSS. So here we have C button, which is just like the default button. If I add C button and I say a C button that's not, I don't know.
Primary.
Yeah, but like I could say not class contains default padding. Oops. What was the default? 5 pixels, 10 pixels? Well, I could add that here. I could actually do this up here. So now if I don't add like the default, I can have a default there if I wanted to. So, and another thing, like if I wanted to even do something like a button that didn't have C-class button, so I just have a plain button here, then I get it that way. Oops, button oh, should work. Might have a typo somewhere. Oh, yep, that works. That just brought in the default. So, yeah, so that's another way of also setting like defaults. As I said, like that can get really messy really quick. So, and it's kind of a nightmare to manage that.
Yeah, because then you have to exclude every other.
But that's where it's like something like you could do something like this and say color primary and like have a prefix in all these.
Yeah.
So then you know that it's doing that. Or you could say this and this. This is a good one. Ends with primary. So if it does not end with primary, then you get that. So then if it ends with primary, then, oh wait, I mean secondary. I screwed that up, whatever. I don't know how I'm screwing that. Oh yeah, wait, no, I don't know. See, like, yeah, it gets, yeah, this is why you don't do it, because it immediately gets very confusing on what you're actually building out.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do anything, you could do something like this, like a default class. Any questions about that? We're halfway through of the excitement. Who's excited?
I'm excited.
All right, cool.
I was looking at his Instagram.
So, yeah, I'm sure he is. It's a good Instagram too. It's one of my favorites. All right. Yeah, I highly recommend it too. All right, before we move on to the next section, do we want to take a quick little 5-minute break? That's shoulder off. All right, I think that's everyone's back. So, you've been posting them? Oh man. Yeah. Yeah, if you guys, if in the chat too, if you can't find a URL, just ping on there and then we'll also share them. So we've been posting those on Twitter, so that's been awesome. That's great. All right, so the next section that we're going to be jumping into is responsive web design. And the goal here is there's a lot that we could cover and do a deep dive in, but we're going to primarily focus on the basics here, so you have a better understanding and foundation. What's up?
Yeah, you should look at the camera more.
Okay. Well, okay. We should move the camera.
This entire video is you just like looking down, like you're shy and afraid.
No. Yeah. Go back. Yeah. Go back to. Stop telling me what to do, Alex. Yeah. Maybe we should have had the camera over here, like where this one is. Yeah. For next time. Ow. I just hit my hand. All right, cool. So we're going to talk about responsive web design. We're going to move on from this button. One of the other things is CSS. You should have your var selectors at the top. And this is a reference to IT CSS or IT CSS. So IT CSS is this methodology about organization on your CSS. So Harry Roberts created it. This is one of the best videos that you could watch about CSS. It's an hour and 13 minutes long. This is one of those things I think for a lot of individuals could be like the light bulb goes off, especially when it goes to architecture. Really quick, I'll bring up IT CSS. Inside here, it shows the fundamentals, so settings, tools, generic. Generic are things like your normalize and resets. Elements are element type selectors. I typically put my resets on the element layer, and then there's objects, which are more object-oriented CSS, so structural pieces. And then we have components that are core to a single application design, and then trubs, which are overrides or utilities or helpers. So that's IT CSS or inverted triangle CSS. That's what it stands for. I just want to make sure, Kyle, are we recording audio coming through? Cool.
There's bars.
Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure because I kind of just started up again. All right, so that's where body's at the top because it's a type selector or generic, and it's there, it's being defined, and all these pieces below. These are C for components, and it goes from there. And then this is higher specificity, so it's at the bottom. So the higher specificity you put at the bottom of your CSS. So potentially, again, remember when we talked about inheritance and the level of it, you want to have those so they're competing appropriately. All right, so we're going to get into objects here and talk about responsive web design. So one of the things I always do is I create O container. O, again, stands for object, and container is just something that's going to hold my CSS. So I'm going to give it a max width of, for today, because my screen's small, I'm going to give it a max width of 800 pixels. One of the things that my buddy and I, so Tim Vonderlo and I started doing a couple years ago, because we were doing a lot of web design, believe it or not, and with that, primarily, I would say 99.99% of the projects we did were responsive. And if we weren't doing responsive, we were typically charging people more to do it because nowadays it's just the way that we craft websites. And with that, we started designing our websites in Photoshop and Sketch at a width of 768. And we did 768 as our primary width because that is the width of the iPad when it's in portrait mode. So when iPad's in portrait mode, it's one of the hardest designs to do a navigation. So there's this back and forth with responsive web design. And does everyone here know what responsive web design is? I believe everyone mentioned that they did.
Lahodas says yep.
Okay.
Yes, sir, yes, sir.
Okay.
Dan wanted to know what the address for UI Arch.
I will be sharing that at the end. So that is on my GitHub right now. So, but we will share that later on. So, responsive web design, just for those, yeah, the official definition is that you're designing with one code base, and it's just using HTML and CSS. And the idea is that you have one code base from small screens to large screens that your website is adapting to various contexts. So in your CSS, you are changing the way that the interface is being portrayed to display the content. Old ways of designing for mobile was you used to have like an M-dot or a mobile dot version of your website where you use user agents, and what you did was you actually had two variations of your website. One that was your mobile site, and one was your desktop site. So this is just using CSS to re-render the website for various widths and context, heights, and other things. I shouldn't have said widths because responsive web design isn't just about width. That's where a lot of people go to think about it, but it's also other things come into play like touch capabilities, tap capabilities, gestures, and all these other variants. But it means you have one code base that's various for different contexts.
Is that usually usually based on screen size / user agent that it identifies, hey, this is for this?
It varies things. It depends on the interface. Majority of the time people use width and screen size, so it's a viewport of your browser. All right, so here, and again, so we typically design at 768 because it's the hardest one to design at. And then we usually go up to about 1440 as a width. It's an arbitrary number. It just seems to work on most browsers. Once we get above a larger screen, so this screen is it's either 28 or 32 inch screen. Once we get bigger than that, usually what we do is we scale up the font. And that's why I created that scaling font size library, which is available on my GitHub or on my CodePen. And the reason is, the larger the screen, the less likely you are going to be like a foot away. So I'm about a foot or two away from my monitor right here, and my font size doesn't need to be any bigger. And yeah, probably about 3 feet, right? Yeah. So yeah. All right, thanks, Kyle. But the larger your screen is, the most likely you're going to be farther away. So if you look at a 42-inch screen or a 70-inch screen, how likely is it that you're going to be 1 to 3 feet away from it? Probably very unlikely. So what that means is the farther you are away from your monitor, the larger the font size has to be. So with that, a power user, if you have, say, a 70-inch screen, you're probably not blowing up your website to be 70 inches wide. You're probably having multiple columns and grids inside there, and you're designing. You're not going to need to design your website up to 70 inches. You design your website to scale up. And that's what's something that we started doing. So we start designs at 768, we go up to 1440, and then above there, we have an arbitrary number that's like, let's start scaling it bigger, and we use my library to do that. So the same website becomes the same, and we start going downward. So anyways, this is the start of really putting this together. I'm going to put all this code and everything that we have here inside of a container. So this is starting to get messy in here. All right, so I'm going to type o-container, and in CodePen, if I do this, if I type the class and I hit this, it does the code for me. I've probably been doing that, I didn't realize it. I'm used to those shortcuts. Just so you guys know, encoding. Emmet, cheat sheet. So this is a cheat sheet for Zen coding or Emmet. So these are all like the shortcuts that you can have inside here. So if I wanted to create 3 headers with header 1, 2, 3, 4, this is how I would do it. I just put it here, paste it in here, and I hit tab, and it made all those for me, which is kind of cool. So you know, if you're writing a lot of code, these are helpful and nice to know. Some of them are pretty complex. It's easy to pick up. The most common one is probably the lorem that I use, as well as the dot in the class. But that works with any selectors. All right, so now we have all of this code. Where were we? We're at O-container. So O-container, after that large rant or huge rant about responsive web design and the ways that we do screens, we'll now get into what this is. So for purposes of this demo, I'm just going to put an outline of 1 pixel, solid, red, just so you can see this container that's here. Now, a lot of times my interfaces, I do margin left, auto, and margin right, auto. And what this does is it centers it in the middle of the page, so it's fighting against the 2 sides of it. It's like margin right, margin left, and it pushes it to the max width. Now, before changing this to max width, I'm going to put it as width, and it does the exact same thing. Now, why I do max width is if we change this view. Let's do this. And let's make this guy be smaller. You'll see that my content flows off to the side. Like, it starts having a scroll on the x-axis, and I don't see any flow over or reset. If I did this as a max width, what would happen is once I get to 800 pixels, it would start going like this. So that's kind of step 1 of making this work. So max width, we'll center it, and then once we get to 800, it goes this. One of the things that you'll notice around here is this border around here. Guess where that's from, Alex?
The border? The HTML.
If someone can guess where it's from and what the property and value is, becomes my favorite person right now.
It's from O-container.
It's a box sizing border box, and that should have been set. That should have been one of the resets, correct? But I don't know if we have that set up at the top.
That is not correct. It's a good try.
It says outline.
Are you talking about the user agent?
It is. Which property and which element by default? If I hit inspect, which one would I go to?
would go to the
Body.
Body.
you would go to the div that has the container.
So this here is actually coming from, no, if we look at HTML, it's not there. Where do you think it will be? This weird padding around here, or this gutter.
The div outside the body?
No, it's in the body tag. It's right here. It's margin 8. It's from the user agent margin 8. Come on, everyone knows that.
I thought you were talking about the red line.
Margin 0. So that would be a reset. Yeah, that would be a reset. So that is what you refer to as a reset. I do that on all my projects. Another thing, Dan, thanks for bringing this one up. This is the star selector. Star selector, box sizing. If I put box sizing, border box, it's inside here. Hey, and my only contribution to the HTML boilerplate was this line of code. So I added these things. And I think this was also added into, what's it called, Bootstrap from the HTML template. I don't remember if I committed that or not, which I hope not. I don't want to have anything to deal with that. But anyways, these are inside. And what this does is allows me to have border box on every element, even before and after. And then my margin is now here at 800 pixels because beforehand, it was actually starting to break at 816 as opposed to 800 pixels. So now it's been fixed. I will do something really quick. I do have a video on box sizing on YouTube, so I would recommend watching that. Before I do that really quick, I'm just going to do a quick little demo here, and it's going to be called Demo 1. And then I'm going to create Demo 2. And this, again, will be very, very fast, so I apologize. So width is 800 pixels here, and we're going to have width here is width 800 pixels. And I'm going to remove border box up here, or box sizing. Oh, crap. Thanks a lot. And I'm going to add demo 1 here. And I'm going to put long, and we're going to do the same here. And we're going to call this 2. So these will be at the top. And demo 1 and demo 2 will have a background color, just so we can see it, of black. All right, so here we go. Very cool stuff. We'll do margin left. I want to know how many times in my life I've written margin left, margin right, auto. Yeah. Anyways, so these guys are looking pretty much the same right now. I'm also going to space these out. So you can see them. So here we have these 2 boxes, and they've been separated out, and they're both the same width. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add padding to both of them. So both of these selectors get a padding of 40 pixels. So it goes out there. What has happened here is these have actually become 880. And that's because there is no box sizing. These are content box. So this is actually being rendered at 880. So do you see that in the top left-hand corner up there where it says 880? So that's 40 plus 40 on 800 width. If I look at computed, you can also see it's 800 with the content here. That's what's referred to as a content block. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change demo 1 here, and I'm going to say box sizing. That's recording, right? OK. I couldn't remember if we went back to it. I'm not questioning you. I'm questioning myself.
It's okay. I'm just partially funded.
Hey. All right, so what's happened here is this demo 1 has box sizing border box, and this is now at 800 pixels, and the padding's on the inside. So the difference between the two is border box looks at content width and then expands outside. That's content box. Border box looks at the container and keeps it as a fixed width and puts the padding inside of it. And that's the difference between the two. WebKit browsers use content box first, which is bizarre, or maybe not. It's just the way that I think about rendering containers. I think of the outside. where non-WebKit browsers, i.e. in legacy browsers, do actually border box. So that's why I recommend from the beginning to do something, because say if I actually wanted this to be 800, I'd have to do the math in my head, say 800 minus 880 is 720, and now they're the same widths, but one is using border box and one is not. And to me, that seems very bizarre for me to do the math in my head, especially once we start getting in media queries. So that was one of the big switches that happened. So if I were then to add border box on all these guys, so now that bottom one would actually be 720, and the top one would be 800. Quick demo on border box. Do not add border box to your project if it does not have it without checking every single component on your site. If you think it's a brilliant idea to work on a legacy project and add box sizing border box, you will destroy the website. So don't do it on every star selector if it's a legacy project. Start using a helper class or some kind of namespace to do it.
Hey, Kevin, is this recording? Because I don't see the recording icon in the upper left-hand side.
We are recording it in a different way. So this is just the one version of this recording. So I'm going to do this.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'll do it just in case.
Right.
This is my backup
Right.
recording, worst case scenario, but I don't think we need it.
Okay.
I don't.
Sorry, Kyle.
Yeah.
I was cracking on Kyle, but.
All right, just because I'm on Instagram, y'all are killing me here.
Hey,
I'll buy you a beer, Kyle, to make you feel better.
Kyle will. Yeah, Kyle. Kyle loves beer.
Yeah. Should I be drinking beer right now?
Do you want a beer? I have a bunch of beer. So, all right. All right, so we have container, we have this width of 800. I'm getting back on track to responsive web design, and we're getting rid of these demo examples. We have container, so what this does is once we get to 800, it's going to start scaling down, and the content inside there goes wah, wah, wah. Typically what I do is I create another wrapper inside of it. So I have O container, and then I have O container wrap. And I typically add this on the wrap side, and I'll explain in a moment. And I do this one as a position relative with an overflow hidden. So by default, a div, which is a block, so because this is a div or any of like the main containers like section, article are going to be full width, so they expand. So that's where you see the red going from one side to another. I like to do this structure and setup because it gives me flexibility from one project to another. And I put this in the video that I sent out to everyone about interface design, and I gave some examples on this, but I'm just going to add that also here and do a quick explanation for those that did not watch that. So now we have this container, and we have container wrap inside of it, and that's being centered inside here. Why I like doing this is if I have a helper class at the end that's a color, let's just call it U for utility, primary dash BG for background, and I say background color is black. It's awful. And then this. So now if I add this to container, we have a full width from one side to another of the black where that's being centered in the middle of the page. Now, the other thing, and I'll talk about this in a moment once we get to more of the responsive side, is I can also have this now be reused in different ways and have this structure so it's not a full bleed background and just have it on a max width. I can then also decide, like at a later time, you know what, this max container that we have, let's cut off our website so it doesn't go past like a certain width, because I may not want to cut my images past like 1800 pixels. So I just say 1800 pixels max width, margin left, auto, and right. So it becomes more of an optimizational thing. I rarely do this, but it's just nice to have this option that once I get over 1800 pixels, then I can center it. Oops, I meant to do max width. So like this browser is not going to hit 1800 pixels because this is a pretty large monitor. But if I were on something bigger, it's this idea like a lot of designers think that we need to design every website to 5,000 pixels wide, but you don't really need to. Yep.
Ben P brings up a really great programming notes. Are you going to run over if you don't get to CSS grid by 1 p.m.? So we have 50 minutes.
All right. Yes, I will contain the next 2 sections inside. Yep. We will get there. All right, so this is the container wrap. This is where this gets important. This is where we get into responsive web design. Is we say at media. And at media, this was created by Ethan Marcotte. I think it was May 10th of 2011. And he brought in traditional CSS, so at media, at print. These capabilities have been around in browsers from the beginning of time. He was the first one just applied to interface design. So we have features and we have types. I'm going to do screen. I'm going to say at, and I'm going to say a min width of 800 pixels. And I'm going to add container wrap inside here. So you put your CSS styling inside here, and it applies it with this condition. So what this is saying is a min width of 800 pixels, apply this stuff. And so under 800 pixels, you don't have that. It looks the same. I could keep this at the top.
This actually, the media queries with regards of min width and max width, this always seems to confuse me. Because I have a hard time determining where the breakpoint is at.
Got it.
If that makes any sense.
Yep. So
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll explain that. So here we go. Let's actually add this on here because we can do this. So what this is saying is any. Ooh, we almost knocked over a guitar. That would have been sweet. Yeah, that would have been fun. So what this is saying is any O container double underscore wrap are 800 pixels width. And then once we get smaller, that is still there, but it doesn't really matter because it's just saying max width. When it is min width, meaning the minimum width is 800 pixels. So once we go below 800, this does not apply. So above 800 pixels, apply these CSS properties. So the minimum to hit is 800, so apply above 800 pixels. The maximum means the maximum width of the viewport once I hit 800 pixels, once I go below 800 pixels, add the margin left and right. So this is saying everything below 800, max width is 800, and this is a minimum, and this is above 800 pixels.
Okay, so the way I think of it is like back in grade school when they had the interval range, and you just have a set point. If it's a max width, then your styles will be applied everything after that. But if it's a minimal width, your styles apply to everything before that. Correct?
We went to 2 very different
that doesn't.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
Maybe if I can try to do it, min width.
The way I kind of think about it is like kind of like a JavaScript if statement in a way.
Yeah.
You're saying if that content is for the min width. You say if that content is above that minimum width, then it'll be true. It'll be active.
Yeah.
And so then that'll, I don't know if that makes sense.
And you can also have other ones inside here too, which will really confuse you. If I say like min height of 500 pixels too, so this would be other things to take into account. So like once it goes above that, it would break that. So if I don't know why that's not breaking. Oh, I have a typo here somewhere. Oh, it's right here. So this would not apply. I don't know why that's not working. But anyways, in another video I have, I talk about the difference between those two and show that demo. Basically, this is above 840, and this is below 840. It was the one that I shared out ahead of time. So.
Okay, that makes more sense.
So what I've done here is, I've added a margin left and right on this to give it a gutter once it gets smaller. So it's 20 plus 20 is 840 here, which again, this container was 800 pixels. So 20 plus 20 is 40, and 40 plus 800 is 840. So that's my breaking point here. And then that's why I have these constant gutters on the left and right. So that's where this overflow right here, 20 pixels and 20 on each side are there. It's because I've defined them. And then this gets into why I like to do this pattern is I can do another variation of this. So these are going to look the same pretty much. Well, at the lower screen, this one doesn't have the padding, and this one has a padding. So with this, I need to make the alt version of it. And all I do is max width this. Oops. And then I add the same here. So this one does not have a media query attached to it, and this bottom one does. So when they're at full width, they're the same size, but then once we get to 840, this guy has gutters on it and this one doesn't, so I can control the gutters separately. So if I want to add my own padding in that area, I can, or my own gutters, I can. So it's just a full width. So I would use something like this for an image if I wanted it to be consistent from one screen to another. Once it gets smaller, it scales down, and then this is a good way of looking at content.
Because in the media query, therefore, it doesn't have that left gutter, correct?
Yeah, it's a different name. So full gets this, and the other one gets this gutters on the side. So.
Okay. I see now.
Oops. All right. So that is the quickest way you can explain responsive web design without blowing your mind and making you go insane. Any quick questions about that? Because we're going to spend the remainder of this building out an interface. And we'll hit on all the topics here.
Yeah, we got to cover that CSS grid stuff.
Got to, yeah. Cool, guys?
Sounds good.
All right, I want to sign.
Yeah, I guess I'm just interested more about your library for greater than 1440, and just how you went about that. If you want to, I don't know necessarily right now, but maybe at the very end, if you want to just review kind of what your library does.
Yeah.
Cool.
So what I'll also show you guys here is this. So I have been working on this open source project for a couple years. It's called UI Arc.io. It's a skinless UI library. It is very close to being released. I was working on this 11 hours ago too. But this is the framework that I built that allows me to make reusable code from one project to another. The big difference between this and other libraries are it's not another Bootstrap or anything like that. What it allows you to do is, let me do this. We have this setup inside here where we're following ITCSS, but it's this architecture where I have global components, brand components, and then application components. So it's the idea of global means that's the core of this library, and these should never be edited or moved, but you can also have plugins added in. So a global plugin is similar to like an NPM package. Like if I wanted to create an accordion, so something that you click on and expands down, I could build it inside here where it would have the CSS and JavaScript associated with it. Now it wouldn't conflict or override anything in my library, it would just be added inside this folder. And from there, the core library is a lot of the resets, the normalizes, and the objects inside of it. But it even takes into account some configurations, such as those box resets and resizing, and anything that you wouldn't want from one project. So this is written in a way that if you have a project that's legacy, or even if you're using Bootstrap, or even something as funny and hilarious as SharePoint, you could still use this library and integrate inside there.
Does it work with React?
Yeah, it would work with React. Yeah.
Yes?
Yes. Yeah, it would.
And I'm sure you probably described the differences between the brand and application.
Yeah.
But could you maybe elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, so the idea is global means it's on every single project, and it's a core utility helpers. And inside the library itself, I have documentation on how every single piece of these would work. It includes mix-ins and functions, but the utility helpers are really where things are like getting you going. So it has like margin resets, left, right. It has order in here. It has a whole pattern spacing library. It has the definition of how colors can be defined and used. And I don't know what's up with my internet here. But there's a bunch of little pieces and parts that are built inside here, and it's fully documented. Again, it's still in like a beta version, but the only thing is the CSS is done, documentation is just in beta. But what you do is you create a new brand. So brand core is the default. But say you're Abercrombie or something like that, you would have Abercrombie as your core brand, but then you could have Hollister as another brand, their fitness one as another brand. And all it is the different typography, colors, and stylings for that specific brand. And those inherit and take the global and extend them to meet your brand. So it uses CSS or Sass variables to override it, and then you just update the colors, your typography, and then customize things like form field and special components for your brand. But you follow the same DOM structures from one project to another, and you follow the patterns in the CSS architecture to update to your brand. And then the last layer is application. An application is meant for specific components or content. The example I always give is in banking, the difference between maybe the .com or marketing website versus the account site. The account site has a lot more tabular data, and it has content that's specific to transactions, which would never show up on the marketing site. So you separate your CSS and your structures for applications and the necessary components. So it's an idea of organizing your CSS for reusability to prevent bloat, and then also flexibility for whatever your UI is. So that is out there, and it follows these patterns that I have. And I actually have a playground of it inside of CodePen. So if I open up my CodePen here, I don't know if this is public. I can make this public. I'll do it right now if it's not. Let's see what's in here. Yeah. So this is not public, but I'll switch this over right now. So this is the last version of it that was released. So like if I put O container, and I put O container, so these things that I was doing earlier are all built in here. And then if I put this, and I put lorem 40, you'll see that this is centered in the page, or it should be. Maybe not. But if I do, I haven't really played that much around here. And this could just be broken because it is a work in progress. But it does bring in these pieces and parts inside here, like my spacing libraries in there. So different things from the beginning. And then I also have like Flex built in here and all the different components. So you can start using this today. This one that's on the CDN may just not be updated. Stuff like this, like really quickly I can show you. If I wanted just to say, and then these guys would be right there. Oops. Right next to each other. And then I can do something like this. to give them space in between. So I can easily create interfaces with pretty much not much thinking these days. And something like that would probably take you some time to do, but it's just becoming familiar with the naming conventions, which are all documented. Like I've spaced out these sections, and I've spaced out these pieces in between, and I've created this grid and did the resets. So, and if I want to change these to other colors, here's the secondary color, and then dark, dark. And the branding is where the colors change as well as the font selection changes.
So we had a follow-up question on the React thing. He sent specifically, does it integrate okay with, there's this GitHub project called Styled Components? Or React Native?
Yeah, so no, in React Native, it would not as of right now. React.js, yes. I've talked about doing some kind of variation on it and aligning to it, and it's just because React Native doesn't have all the CSS properties, and I'm hoping that they actually move over to Grid as opposed to Flex in the next one of the next releases. But the idea here is, a lot of people get confused by styling the components in CSS and especially React.js. The React.js styles that are in line to a component are meant for functionality, not for stylistic or definitions of global, I guess, resets or normalize. So you would use this project, and then instead of using like the plugin features and setups that we have written, you would just build those inside your React component. And those are things that like I want to have more demos of this once it's finalized and it's out of like the beta version. That I'll probably be building out some React Native or React.js examples and aligning it to how it would work. Cool. All right. We're going to hit on the grid systems here and make Ben happy.
12:30.
Yeah, I know. I blame the government.
I blame React Native.
I blame React Native for sure. All right. Yeah, common. Actually, I'm going to do this. We'll just give these stupid names like 1, 2, 3, 4, just so we can keep track of them. All right, here we're going to dive into Flex. One of the things that I would say is a really great learning point for Flex is if you go to CSS Tricks, again, Chris Corley's getting a bunch of shout outs here, but if you do CSS Tricks and you say beginner guide to Flexbox, this is awesome. This is fantastic to learn Flexbox and the ins and outs of it. So this is a good spot for it. What is the? There's like a lily pad Flex. This game teaches you how to play. It's a game, but it teaches you how to play. Teaches you Flex. So you play this game and you learn Flex. And it's really fun, and it's if you know how to code, you can get through it really quick. But it's a great way to learn. And they recently came out with the grid version of it, which is fantastic. So it's a game that you play, but you do it by coding, and it teaches you the ins and outs of it. So that's Grid Garden, and then the Flexbox Froggy. And then for CSS here, CSS Tricks, Guide to Flexbox. It's kind of the everything about it. But then if you do CSS Tricks, Guide to Grid, it also has the newest one added, which is great.
To add to the Flexbox, we were talking about that in our free code camp meeting for our repair session, and someone brought up about CSS zombies. and it's supposed to be CSS Froggy on steroids. So if you guys are looking for something like more of like core practice, CSS Zombies is pretty neat. It's still gamified and it's pretty challenging. So
that's all. Yeah, I remember there was a Ruby one of that. That was pretty sweet.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to do something here. I'm just going to reset this really fast. So I'm going to do it up here. This is my typical setup on this stuff. Cool. All right, and I'm going to get rid of this. So I'm just using a list item, and I'm resetting this. And all I have here is we're focusing on this 1, 2, 3, 4 up here, and I've created OFlex. OFlex is going to be Flexbox. And I'm going to put a display flex. By default, it has a flex direction of left and right. Oops. I did not put you on list here. I put pipes in here to separate my code, and you can put whatever you want, but I like doing that. You don't need to put anything there. It's just for organization. But we have 1, 2, 3, and that's coming from Flex, so it kind of puts them in line. If I remove that, you can see that they're stacked, and I've reset that on list. What I'm going to do is, for this demo, I'm just going to outline them. And I'm going to give them a background color of red. I need to think of better colors when I'm doing stuff like this. All right.
Chartreuse.
I should. If I could only spell that. All right. And let's give this an outline of black now. Champagne. All right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4. These are in line right here, and these guys aren't doing that much. There's different variations that I can put inside here. I'm looking at my peep here so I don't forget anything that I want to cover really quick. But by default, the direction is going left to right. One of the things you can do is there's what are referred to as parent and then child. So I'm going to go through them all. I'm just going to add a class just called demo and walk you through these. But typically, in like the library I wrote, they're all inside there. But I'm going to say justify content center. And now that's moved it into the middle. By default, it's on a flex start. I can also do flex end, and it's going to move it on the right side, which is pretty cool. One of the big tricks that's in CSS or inside of Flex is taking advantage of margin. And a lot of people don't know this, but if I said something like nth child 2, so this is the second child, I say margin left auto. It's going to bump this other one, if I could spell, off to the side. So it moves that guy over there. If I were to do 3, it's going to bump these other 2 over, which is a cool little layout here. So that's one of those tips and tricks of Flex that a lot of people don't know about. It uses margin. If I wanted the 3 to be separated on both sides and be in the middle on both of them, this is would typically be a very hard interface to design, but in a couple lines of code, you have that interface, which is cool. But we're going to keep here. So that's justify content. What it does is it moves your content that's inside of it from one side to another. And there's start, end, there's stretch, and then there's evenly and space in between and all of them. But again, those are all in the CSS one that's out there. The next one that I'm going to show you is align content, which this is not going to work well inside here because we need a height. Let's give this a height of 100 VH. So come on. Come on. One of the confusing things that I keep getting screwed up with is grid uses align content and align items, what I think backwards and different, and how they do the directions, which, anyways, there we go. So I don't know why that didn't do that from the beginning. But this allows me to look at it in different areas on the page. So that's centered. So it's aligned items in the center. Flex start is going to be at the top, which is the top part. And then end is at the bottom. And then if I wanted the bottom right, I could do justify content, flex end. So it's going to be over here. And if I did flex start, it would go up here. So that allows me to kind of move around pretty quickly. And flex is beyond powerful for building out an interface. The next thing that I'm going to quickly jump into is, so flex direction looks at the direction of where it's going direction-wise, whether it's going from horizontal to vertical. So again, if I do this, these are by default in rows. If I say flex direction, if I can spell, column, you'll see them go this way. If I do something like this, and I say flex 1, these are going to be evenly spaced out and go across the entire screen. I could also say something like this, O flex li, and I'll just say nth child 2. So right now they're not the full width of it. If I do nth child 2 and I say flex 1, it's going to expand that basis so that takes up the remaining space of it. I put out a calculation of how there's what's referred to as flex basis. It's a combination of the variable area of the parent container and the widths that are taken up from its sibling containers and does the math in between. So flex 1 is going to fulfill that full width at proportions that other ones have. So by that I mean if I add this here, and I do 3, 2 and 3 are going to be equal widths, but they're going to be in the middle, and then these are going to be defined here. So that's how flex does this weird calculation of everything inside of it. It's probably the most confusing part of flex. Flex is kind of, it is one of those things that it's easy for me to be like, oh, I want to make a grid here very quick, but if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get results that you're like, I don't know what this means, and I don't know how to do it. And a lot of poor code today that people are writing are just based off of, hey, I'm going to use flex and it's easy to use. And in reality, it's not really that easy to use. It's kind of complex. So again, this is showing you the exact opposite. So this is flex column, and I've defined this as 100 VH, and that's why it's the full width. So it's 100 vertical height. If I did 50, it'd be half my page viewport height, and these are expanding out. If I remove this guy, these are just going to be stacked to the top. Cool? What's up?
Your screen versus what I'm seeing here are two
Yeah,
things.
we're getting, in the recording specifically, it's not showing the flex section correctly.
It's like
It's working in
glitchy kind of.
Yeah, it's like flashing red and green Christmas style.
Oh.
It's festive, but also.
Yeah, that's something I forget. Red doesn't render for some reason on that thing. It's been like that the whole time.
It's doing it with blue too.
Let me think of another color.
It's not as painful to look at.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. Just so you guys know that this will be fine. I'll bring down that red to a different color.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Chartreuse. I think it's chartreuse.
If I could only spell it, I would. All right, did that fix it for you?
I mean, it's just
No,
a
it's
little
still there.
flickery.
Yeah, here. You guys have waited an hour and a half to tell me that?
No, it didn't
I
do
thought
it.
that's what you had on your screen the
Yeah.
entire time.
Yeah, is that fine?
It's fine.
Yeah.
Now it's
Yeah,
just-
so the primary colors don't render for some reason well inside there. Yeah. Just so you guys know, what's happening is on our playback, it comes across as the wrong color. So there we go. More Michigan colors. Oh man, it's like Michigan and Ohio State now. Yeah.
Dan wants to know when you'd use flex over float when building an app bar.
We'll hit on that in the last 10 minutes. Because the next piece here is I'm going to hit on grid. And I know I went through flex really, really fast. And we're probably at this point going to go over. And I apologize for that. But I'm going to do grid really fast. And then we can have questions at the end if anyone has them. I can deep dive into them. All right, so that's flex. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do ogrid. And this is what the whole workshop was supposed to be about. But we're now just getting there. So I'm going to change this top one to ogrid. And O, again, is for object. And right here, we just have this 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'm going to say display grid. So this is newer in CSS. So grid came out. It was a spec that was written about 2 years ago, and it was fast-tracked. And now it is widely accepted in browsers. So if I go to caniuse.com and I search grid, this happened overnight. It's even in IE 11 support for it. And Flex took years to get there. So if I look at grid and Flex, it's the exact same with Opera Mini being the only difference, which Opera Mini, these things that we're building out are primarily meant for desktop. So it defaults really nice for older or bizarre browsers like that. And Opera Mini is not widely accepted in the US. And everyone should be jumping away from Android with all their privacy issues. You guys heard about that? Like Facebook?
That's on. Facebook's on.
Facebook records all your messages, text messages, and phone calls if you're on Android.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. That's why you don't use Android.
You don't allow it to use microphone.
See, but I think it's conspiracy between Apple's bad sales and Android just sucking in general, and then Facebook just being in the middle of all of it. So now Facebook's helping out Apple. Huh. Anyways. Back to chartreuse. I'm going to, yeah, in real world news. What do I want to do here? I'm just going to copy these styles. This was a really bad way to do this demo, but where did I add the background color? Oh. All right. This is just for demo purposes here. All right, so now this top one is going to be the flex. I'm going to add just separation inside here. So flex at the bottom and grid is at the top. And right now, these are looking the same, just because by default, unlike Flex, by default, Flex goes into rows, so it puts them into like a column look. Grid does the exact opposite. It kind of maintains it the way that the DOM structure is. And I actually really like that because that always throws me for a loop. But what I'm going to do in ogrid demo is walk you through different ways of also creating these. Newly made, and there is some confusion kind of between grid and flex and the naming conventions that they have, because grid is newer, and then they fixed a lot of the stuff that was inside there. So first things first, on grid demo is you have what's called grid template row, and you have grid template columns. So inside here, what I'm going to have is grid template row, and I'm going to say 50 pixels. Rows. So now this first guy is defined as 50 pixels. If I make it 150, it becomes 150 pixels. That doesn't seem that exciting, but in development world, that's a huge thing. And if I do 400 pixels, now the first one's 100, and now this one's 400. So it has kind of pushed that content back and forth inside here. Oh, the last thing is I have this min height inside here. Does anyone remember where I put that min height? There we go. Get rid of that. So it's growing based off of the rows. So these are defining each row by each row. I can also do a repeat, which is nice. And I say repeat for 2 times. And it's going to loop through that look and feel. And that's how grid works that way. I typically don't do rows. I do grid, column, or grid template, columns, and define the widths of each one. So if I said 1 FR, this is 1 fraction. And if I said 1 fraction by 1 fraction, this is going to be a 2 by 2 grid. So this is like where grid becomes really, really awesome on creating something. It looks at grid template columns and starts building it out. So if I wanted a 3 column, I would add 1 FR, which is a fraction. If I wanted them all to be on 1, it becomes this way, which is really, really awesome. If I wanted to even simplify my writing, I could go back to repeat, and I could say repeat 3 times 1 FR, and now I have this here, and it's going that way. So that's the shorthand of writing it. And if I added more columns here, they would just keep wrapping into grid rows. And then where you can get into, oops, did that wrong. And you can also define widths or any unit. I think that's just the easiest one to first start learning. And if I could do grid template rows, and I say the first one, let's just do a repeat so they're all the same. 2, and we gave these all, make them 100 pixels. So now they're all 100, and here's 2 rows by 100. So that's literally the easiest thing to ever create a grid. But then this is what makes it even more amazing. Grid, what is it? Give me a second. I reference this because I always want to call it space. It's got a weird name. Grid gap. So there's some new terminology in CSS with grid that I'm still trying to get used to. So what this has done is added grid spacing in between it, which is one of the coolest things ever, because to accomplish what this is doing was a huge CSS hack where you offset it, you add padding, then you offset it. So this is like one of the biggest upgrades that CSS has ever gotten, and it's so stupid because that's all it is just that grid space in between. Where this becomes a really great way for carts. Now, why I was saying earlier I don't like to do grid rows is because if I have more than 2 rows here, it goes back to the default auto height. I typically do columns because I think in columns as opposed to rows. And for something like grid demo here, what I would typically do is I would define a height for the element itself or the component. So imagine this was a shopping cart or a list of results for a product page. I would give these a height of maybe 400 pixels. So now they're all 400 pixels inside here. It should be. Grid.
Spelled height.
Oh yeah, thanks. So that's the other thing with row. There is a nice use case for row, but it's if you're going in the other direction of designing. For the most part, for something like a grid like this, you would build it out that way, which is nice. So the other thing is with these, I can also justify content, align items, and move them all in the same space, similar to how Flex did. Their namings are a little bit backwards. So what I've been trying to figure out is the best way to wrap my head around. Like I know, Dan, you were having issues with the max min on media. I'm having that same issue with justify line for grid because Flex treats it backwards compared to how grid does. So Flex looks at it as the coordinate points, and grid looks at it as the container points. So it's almost the exact opposite, but justify content are the same for both of them, where it's going down like from the horizontal, but then align items is different from the content inside, and it goes vertical. So anything that's aligned in grid is vertical, and anything that's justify is horizontal, which actually makes a lot more sense than how Flex treats it. So that's the way that I've been trying to wrap my head around it. I don't know if anyone has a good suggestion if they played with grid on how to build it.
I think when I played around with grid earlier, like maybe a couple of months ago, and it's super easy, but the biggest obstacle I encountered was, and it may have been just a tutorial I was working with, they talked about how you can template your grid, where you can set your fractions to where you can create your container, you can create different sections within your container, and then inside those sections you can actually grid those out, and there's a way you could template it. But actually at first I thought that was confusing.
Yeah. So
it was like I was in a printer shop and I was actually trying to figure out how to, the technicalities of creating a grid.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
But the way you explain it, it's a lot easier, I think.
That
makes much more sense.
Yeah, but you bring up a really great point here. So let's do this. Let's do it this way. We'll follow some BEM here. You know what's always so funny? I'm always like, oh, I don't know how we'll fill up all this time. I didn't even talk about politics and time went by.
You started to kind of like creep up there, but
I did. I held back. I was like, this is being recorded.
No one said the T word.
Fuck Trump.
There we go.
All right, so to Daniel's point here, I'm just going to build this out really quick. So just so you guys can see like another powerful thing about grid. So I can't use. Kyle, you have to tell me if I'm dancing colors around. All right, so there's this C page here. I'm going to give it a min height. I'm actually going to give it a height of 100 VH here. And Ben, this is to your example of Slack. So this is inside here. This border is this entire container here. So page is inside here. We have header, and inside page, this is also a grid. Oh, it's a container. Let's do this display grid. Display. And now these guys are kind of broken up here. So here's footer. And here's main, just so we can see these. So header, main, footer. Footer, what we're going to do is we're going to say grid, template, rows. And for the top, I'm going to give it an auto, meaning that the height can change based off the content inside of it. The middle is also going to have auto. And the bottom is going to have 80 pixels. So I'm going to give this a background color of black, just so you can see this here, and white. So this is 80 pixels inside here, and that's based off of this. Now if I wanted the top to also be 80 pixels, let's do this, and let's give this a background color of, no, I don't know how to spell that, that's why. Yeah, someone's going to have to do that for me. All right, so now the top is 80 pixels, and if I wanted to make this 100 pixels, I could do this. I could also use other units. I could do 50 VH for 50% of my vertical height and do it that way, which is cool. But I'm going to keep it as auto. So auto, again, like if I put in long here and it gets longer, it's just going to go to the height of this. Oh, these are actually breaking off even. I'll come back to that in a second. But what this allows me to do is these are evenly spaced, and that's it. So this is, if I want to do one, and that would fix that. So this is auto based off the height of it, and then this is the full width. All right, so now you can see like this is maybe looking like a traditional structure of a site. And I could also do something in this if I had this as a height defined as like 70 pixels. And I could say something like main is like a min height of calc 100 vertical h plus 70 pixels, which is the header plus vertical height. So my footer's down at the bottom and I don't see it. Oops, and I turn the overflow off here. Where did I do that? There we go. So now, this is like that look where my header's here, my body's here, and then below the page I have a footer, which is a nice little setup. But I'm not going to do that. And we're going to go back here. So I'm going to give this a height of this, and I'm also going to say an overflow hidden. And this is going to be more of like an app look feel. And inside main, I'm going to have main have a structure inside here that is content. A shit ton of content has now been added. Yeah.
By the way, Kev, it's CHARTREUSE.
I forgot how to spell it before you started it. Chartreuse. I don't even know how to say that. So inside here we have this guy, and you can see that it's flowing outside this box, which is not what I wanted to do. I would say overflow hidden. So now we have this, but now it's not scrolling. So what I need to do is my favorite setup. I say WebKit. Jeez Louise. Overflow scrolling, which is, this gives you that nice touch feel on anything that's a touch device. Right now it's not going to work on the desktop. If I want this to work on the desktop, I have to put overflow auto. And now this middle section is going to scroll, but the rest of it won't. So now we have a fixed header and a footer down there, which is nicely placed. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to add a header here, and I'm just going to call it hello. And then I'm going to add another header here, and I'm going to call it H2, and I'm going to call it hi, hey. And then I'm going to add a paragraph here, and I'm going to say 30, and I'm going to say hey yo. Hey yo. And I'm going to put a paragraph here, and I'm going to give it a lot of text here. This is pretty much all I do by myself at night. I'm just like, let's build out an interface for fun. Yeah, that's why I'm still single. And the puppets. All right, so inside this C page, again, I would not recommend doing a type selector as a styling, but I'm going to for purposes of demo. And I'm going to say H2. You're going to get a background color of black, and you're going to get a color of white. So these guys down here, you'll see.
Those backgrounds both wrong?
Yeah. I was just seeing if you guys were paying attention.
That's a constant one.
Yeah, I can't spell background. C page H2. Did I typo something else?
You'd think the tools would tell you when you type out stuff.
Oh, I have some, no? What am I doing wrong here? C page. Does anyone else see anything really quick? Main content, H2, header, hey yo. Oh, it's just really down on the page. All right, so what I'm also going to do inside CMain is I'm going to add where did I put that? Sorry, I'm trying to move too quick. Inside CMain, I'm going to give it a position relative. And I'm actually going to convert those from C page here and put these CMain here. And I'm going to give these a position sticky. And what this will do is, and I have to define a top 0 on this. As I scroll down, as we find these headers, and headers are down here and down here, do you see how they stick there? Bam, look how nice that is.
I think we're getting some lag again.
Okay. But basically what I've done here is I've created this container that scrolls, and then these guys get sticky here. And I think that's one of the coolest things that's just purely CSS. So now getting with some additional things with grid and setup, just really fast on here. So we could add additional pieces and parts. But back to what Daniel was asking and the setup here. So there's what's referred to as grid templates. A lot of times you don't need them, but there is a lot of awesome benefits to them. So let's call it grid template areas. And inside here, you give each grid a name. So before I do this, I'm going to go through and say header has a name, grid area. No one else has ever done that, and you've almost knocked it over time. No, that's absolutely true.
I disagree.
No, has Ryan ever done that?
Never.
Yeah, and Ryan sits there every day. I have some guitars in this office, and Alex has almost knocked over a computer twice, or a guitar. All right, so I've given these all names, and now in how you give them a name, you call them grid area, and you give them a whatever you want to call it. You can call it pizza, you can call it Kevin, you can call it whatever. And you use grid template areas in quotes to identify how they get rendered. So we have header, and then after header, we want footer, and then we want main. And you'll see this render in the order that they're here. Header, footer, main. But now I can switch the order of these and put them in the correct order. So what it allows me to do is move around my DOM and reorder them in different ways. But then this gets really cool is if I add something like a sidebar or a nav. So let's add nav here. Oh, geez. What am I doing? All right, so let's go back and add our fun buttons that we did earlier. Are they still in there? All right. So right now, do you see how this button's just down there? It's just floating because it doesn't have a definition. Well, let's give it a name. Let's say nav is called nav. And now nav is getting rendered, but it's just off to the side because it doesn't know what to do with it. What we can do is put nav next to this, and we put header, header, and we put footer, footer, and now we have this setup of header, nav, main, footer. So if I wanted to put the nav on the other side, I would switch it here. So now the nav's on the right side, and this is the only area that's scrolling.
What does header, header do?
Header, header, so this creates a grid. So for every single component, if I added a third one here, if I had another DOM element that I wanted to render in this grid area, I would have to have 3 columns. Because this main section here, this guy right here, has 2 columns, I have to treat header to take up the full width. So if I didn't want header to expand the full width, it would stop right here. Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of weird how they treat it. I don't necessarily like it. That's why. But it's really easy to know. And then if I wanted the nav not to be in the main area, I wanted it to be in header, I can put it up there. And the same thing happens. I don't know why that's lagging. Oh. And now we have the header at the top. And it's as simple as that. And then the rows here are still being defined as that order. But then I could say something like this. Actually, I'm going to define the width here. Sometimes I like overthink this, and I start using grid for things. So I can give this a width of 320, old iPhone size. And let's move this down to this area again, because that's a weird spot for this.
We've got at least 2 blown minds right now. 3.
Yeah, yeah, isn't that crazy? And so like that is a really good setup for a navigation here. So back to like one of the things that I was talking earlier about, like if I wanted to create an interface of like Slack or something, I could follow the structure very easily. I would probably actually use grid in it if my browser support was everything above IE11. I like to, I haven't used grid in production. I did just write the documentation into UI Arc the other day because it has been really great to use. Again, I haven't used it in production. I think we're going to be using it in the next version of the Vibe app that we do. And for that, it allows a little bit more flexibility. And with this, like, say I get rid of, this is what's there's some weird, bizarre stuff. So if you're using the template areas, I would say only use it on global like structures like this, something that's going to be like your app container, not individual sections. Use grid if you have items that are coming through and you want multiples of them coming through. Use grid without template areas, or use Flex, because Flex is really, really great. And I've done a lot of videos on Flex, so this is really the first time I've recorded anything on grid. So what I can also do is I'm doing a weekly online class. It's not a class, it's just me doing exactly this, what I just do for fun. And I do a lot of mentoring of the students. And with that, I've been recording my sessions. So I'm going to start recording and publishing about once a week different videos. So if there's something that I didn't cover today but you really want to hear, you can tweet at me at Nice Transition, or at the end of this we can cover it. But that's basically it from kind of start to finish. Really quick on this stuff. As I said, like I do have these built in to this UI Arc stuff right now. So if you wanted to even play with grid right now and do exactly this demo, you don't have to write the CSS. You can just use this and start building. And if I do this, the only thing is you would have to define your template, your grids inside here. And I wrote some like things in here. So if I wanted a 3-column grid, it's just this. So little nice things like that are already built in. And the documentation's out there too. If I wanted a 4-column grid, it's right there. So, cool. Yeah, any questions?
I've got at least one.
Okay.
This is from Dan Stockham. Quote, "For the end, I wanted to ask if there's a way we can test our CSS to make sure we're not being too specific."
There is a great article that, well, I'm answering this wrong, but I'm going to show this one. So CSS Wizardry is Harry Roberts' website. And on his website recently, he had this really great article. So if there's someone that you subscribe to and read a blog in the UI, UX world, he's someone that I would definitely recommend doing. So his case studies here. Where are his articles? They always get published in a million places, but definitely look up his stuff that he's doing and his writings. Oh, they're just down at the bottom. Finding dead in CSS. This is an awesome, awesome trick. So for old CSS selectors in Legacy, you add a 1 dead pixel image that renders, and you start tracking it to see which ones aren't rendering, and you start deleting those CSS selectors. So it's a way to use Google or your analytics package to track the performance of CSS and to delete ones that you don't need anymore. It's a really cool concept. But in your question, Dan, really it's if you're running into what Harry Roberts always calls specificity wars, where you're trying to increase it or figure out where it is, the best thing to do is right-click on an element and see how long it is. Ideally, there's the rule of inception, and they say never go forward deep because it gets too confusing to understand and comprehend. But even with that, I think that's too far. I usually go 2 layers, and it's on a component level. If you're following BEM, ITCSS, SMAX, object-oriented CSS, you should never run into these issues. If you're in legacy projects, you are going to have to deal with the specificity wars. There isn't really a tool that I know that does that though. Maybe Gulp does. So
It's more of a discipline than
yep.
than it is, say, like running it through like test-driven development in a sense.
Yeah, there's performance in CSS too that you have to pay attention to. One of the easiest ways of seeing it is on a mobile phone, and not a modern one. If you want to test your CSS, I would say use something like anything before the iPhone 5S or 5S. And as you're scrolling on the web, you'll see it like kind of like jitter or render weird. That's usually a CSS issue. Safari has really great tools on looking at how painting happens. So when you have Chrome developer tools, if you're scrolling through, it'll start flashing red if you're using too much processing power and selectors that are too heavy. Things like this, this is actually pretty intensive on processing power. It is fast, and these things do get optimized by browsers and the spec itself over time. But I would be conscious of that. And the best way of looking at it is if you go to inspect and you go to performance. It's been a while since I've done this. Where do I want to do this?
Performance, not anxiety.
I can't think of, what do I want to do here? Computed. But there's a paint layer here. Here we go. And then it will track where things are going, and then you can optimize your CSS selectors and find things that are really like bogging down. So this will look at all the paint layers and how CSS actually renders on the page and let you know if there's performance issues. Oh, this is really cool. I haven't checked this out in a while. Paul Irish wrote all this. Paul Irish is he's head of the Google Chrome project, so the Chrome project. His videos on performance and optimization are some of the best. Like he'll go out to a website, like a famous website, or not famous, like a national brand, and just tear apart the website about performance. It's the best thing ever. Paul Irish, yeah. Yeah, he went kind of MIA for about 5 years. He was working on some Google projects, and him and who's the guy that wrote the original Node package for front end. It had a bird in it. It died out because of NPM. Doesn't matter. He wrote Angular too, so.
Was it Bowler?
No. I want to call him Aziz Ansari.
Toucan?
No. Any other questions as I try to think this up? I'd follow him on Twitter. Man, I cannot think of his name. Nazis. Yep, that's what I'm looking up. Well. Questions? So, cool. Just real quick, if you guys have follow-up questions, feel free to email me. You guys have all my contact information. And then one of the things that I also said for this workshop, because it was remote, and if you could provide feedback or suggestions on how we can make these better, and if we miss the mark doing it remote, let me know. And then it's not really anything easier or harder for us to do it in person or remote. It's more about like you guys and having the ability to communicate and also maybe play around as things are going on. But if I miss a mark there, let me know. This was the first time trial, so I appreciate you guys for being a part of it. If you have questions, reach out to me, and I'm going to schedule a time where we can all get together and just geek out about this stuff and have any follow-up questions. I'm thinking about maybe 2 to 3 weeks out. So I'm going to send you guys a doodle, and we can pick some times. And the idea is just for us to get together, maybe have a couple drinks or coffee, and to continue this conversation. And for those that don't know each other or haven't met in real life, have the opportunity to meet. And then, again, if you have any questions, reach out to me directly. And thank you, guys. That's about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.